Have you ever wondered how ordinary people can commit some of the worst crimes in history and feel no guilt? Or why, even after all the horrors of the 20th century, authoritarianism keeps coming back with new masks? Hannah Arendt lived through all of this. She fled the Nazis, was arrested, lost her homeland, and watched evil spread up close, not as something monstrous, but as something disturbingly ordinary. In this video, you're going to discover the story of a woman who challenged philosophers, politicians, and even common sense. A thinker who refused easy answers and believed that truly thinking could save lives. Get ready to step into Arendt's world, where politics is action, freedom is courage, and evil can be born from something as simple as blindly obeying orders. Hannah Arendt was born in 1906 in the small town of Linden, Germany, in a century that carried within it both the horrors of totalitarianism and the promise of revolutions in human thought. Before becoming one of the sharpest minds of the 20th century, her childhood already revealed the traits of a restless, deep, and intensely sensitive mind. But how is a philosopher born? What kind of pain and unease shape a spirit that would later confront the darkest sides of modernity? From an early age, Hannah was forced to face the impermanence of life. Her father, Paul Arendt, died when she was still a child, a victim of syphilis. This early loss was not just a physical absence, it was an existential wound. In her home, there was no room for the comforting illusion that the world was safe or predictable. Grief, silent and premature, shaped her view of life as fragile, interruptible, and yet something that deserved to be taken seriously. That experience of loss did not paralyze her. If anything, it may have been what pushed her toward thinking. Her mother, Martha Arendt, was a strong woman, with socialist leanings and secular values. She raised Hannah with intellectual freedom and gave her not only emotional support, but access to the world of culture, literature, and philosophy. In the absence of her father, books became the constant presence. They did not offer easy comfort, but a way to understand the chaos and complexity of existence. And among all the authors, one name stood out very early in her formation: Immanuel Kant. Kant, with his search for practical reason and moral duty, offered young Hannah a framework to think about a world that felt so disordered. The categorical imperative, the idea that our actions should be guided by principles that could be universalized, struck her, even at a young age, as something powerful. It wasn't just about rules, it was about responsibility. Even as a girl, Arendt began to understand that living meant not only feeling, but thinking. Morality was not just something imposed from the outside. It demanded an inner autonomy, a constant inner dialogue. As a teenager, Hannah dove into classical literature with the same intensity she would later dedicate to political questions. She read Goethe, Homer, Lessing, and many others. These authors were not just literary company, they were living voices she engaged with in silence. From early on, Arendt felt that the past was more than memory. It was a source of deep understanding of the human condition. Reading was not a hobby, it was her way of being in the world, of searching for meaning where it seemed to slip away. But it wasn't just what she read that shaped her. It was how she read, seriously, with discipline, with a hunger for truth. This early seriousness made her stand out among her classmates, and not without consequences. At school, Hannah was seen as a difficult student. She asked too many questions. She refused ready-made answers. She wouldn't be tamed by formulas. In a Germany still marked by rigid and authoritarian structures, this attitude made people uncomfortable. From very early on, Arendt learned that thinking can be an act of resistance. World War I, 1914, 1918, which unfolded during her childhood and early teenage years, left a deep mark on her entire generation. Millions dead, the collapse of the German Empire, a sense of defeat and humiliation. All of this formed the backdrop of her youth. She grew up in a country in crisis, not only economically or politically, but existentially. Faith in progress, reason and civilization had been shaken, The 20th century was born as a time of rupture, and Hannah felt that intensely. This atmosphere of collapse and disorientation, what she would later describe as the break in tradition, was crucial for the birth of her way of thinking. Arendt was not interested in building a closed philosophical system. What mattered to her was understanding human experience in all its complexity. Her childhood was a kind of training ground for that sensitivity, a time when the world seemed to be falling apart, and thinking became both a way to survive and a way to take responsibility. There is something deeply Socratic in the young Hannah Arendt. Just as Socrates walked through Athens asking uncomfortable questions, Arendt saw thinking as essential to human dignity. For her, thinking was not just a talent, it was an ethical duty. Even before she had the philosophical language she would later develop, that intuition was already there. It is also important to note that Arendt did not see herself as a philosopher in the traditional sense. Later in life, she would say that she belonged more to the political tradition than to academic philosophy. But her childhood clearly shows that the drive that moved her was the same that guided great thinkers since antiquity, the desire to understand. As Aristotle writes at the beginning of the Metaphysics, all humans by nature desire to know. In Hannah, that desire appeared early and never left. There is a very human dimension in the way she was formed. Arendt did not think from cold abstractions. She thought from lived experience, grief, exclusion, restlessness, reading. These were not theoretical themes, but concrete experiences that fed her reflection. This tight bond between life and thought would become one of the strongest marks of her later work. For her, thinking is not an escape from the world, but a way of being in the world with clarity and courage. In the middle of personal loss and a Germany in ruins, there is a young girl reading Kant. That image, simple and powerful at the same time, already says a lot about who Hannah Arendt would become. She was not looking for refuge in books, but for tools to understand what was happening around her. This investigative gaze, this refusal to accept the world as something fixed and unquestionable, is what would later make her one of the great voices against totalitarianism, the banality of evil, and the abandonment of critical thinking. Her teenage years would eventually lead her to university, where she would meet Martin Heidegger, her first great teacher and the center of a complex and controversial personal relationship. But before that, it's important to see how the ground was already prepared. Hannah Arendt did not appear out of nowhere. She was forged in loss and in books, in absence and in thought. And it was this existential foundation that later allowed her to ask the questions others avoided. Questions like, how was Auschwitz possible? What does it mean to act politically? And how can evil become banal? These questions do not grow only out of theory, but out of life itself. And that is why they still challenge us today. In 1924, at 18 years old, Hannah Arendt entered the University of Marburg to study philosophy. Young, Jewish, intellectually precocious, she carried a deep restlessness, not just a hunger for knowledge, but a need to understand the meaning of existence itself. The German academic world of the 1920s was buzzing with new ideas, but what Arendt found there went far beyond anything she could have expected. It was the beginning of a journey marked by fascination, pain, rupture, and also love. A philosophical, existential, controversial love. Her relationship with Martin Heidegger. Heidegger, then 35, was already an enigmatic figure. Charismatic, brilliant, he had an almost hypnotic presence in the classroom. His teaching style was anything but conventional. He didn't just explain texts, he plunged into them with almost poetic intensity, pulling out what was most hidden, most essential. Arendt was immediately captivated, not only by his intelligence, but by the radical experience of thinking that he embodied. Their connection quickly became more than academic. A deep and intense love affair began between them, wrapped in secrecy, tension, and distance. Heidegger was married. Arendt was his student. The social, ethical, and political barriers were enormous. But beyond the scandal, What really matters is how much this relationship shaped Arendt's philosophical awakening. Heidegger didn't just teach philosophy. He embodied a way of thinking that broke with rationalist and rigid systems. His project, which would culminate in Being and Time, 1927, aimed to recover the fundamental question, what does it mean to be? In an increasingly technical, instrumental world, where human beings were being reduced to functions, Heidegger proposed a radical ontological investigation to think about being starting from concrete human existence, what he called Dasein. For Arendt, this was a shock that changed everything. For the first time, philosophy wasn't presented as something abstract or merely moralistic, but as a way of grasping the human condition as a whole. Existence, time, finitude, freedom, all of these gained new depth. Heidegger offered a language and a style of thought that freed philosophy from formulas and reconnected it to life. But Arendt was never passive in this process. While she absorbed the depth of Heidegger's thought, she was already tracing her own path. If Heidegger thought being starting from the individual Dasein, a thrown, anxious, finite being, Arendt felt something crucial was missing. The shared world, the space between people, plurality. That absence would later become one of the central points of separation between them. Heidegger turned inward, into being. Arendt, more and more, turned toward the world. Even so, the existential impact of Heidegger on Arendt was undeniable. She discovered that thinking demands courage. The courage to face what is left unsaid, forgotten, or uncomfortable. Heidegger didn't teach ready-made answers. He taught her how to ask real questions. And that is something Arendt would carry for the rest of her life. As she would later say, "The only thing I want is to understand, for understanding is what makes us human." Their love, though real and intense, was full of inevitable tensions. In the letters that survived, we can feel the emotional force of this bond. Arendt writes with passion, but also with clarity. She was not a naive girl overwhelmed by a great thinker. She was a woman who loved with her mind and thought with her heart. Heidegger, in turn, saw in Arendt something rare, a living intelligence that challenged him. In one of his letters, he calls her the light that illuminates my thinking. But that same man would later align himself with the Nazi regime. That wound would never fully heal. Arendt, Jewish, persecuted, exiled, would never completely understand how a philosopher of existence could bow to authoritarianism. Yet she never simply erased her intellectual debt to him. On the contrary, she acknowledged Heidegger's philosophical greatness without forgiving his political cowardice. That tension sits at the core of Arendt's maturity. The ability to think without blind loyalty, to love without idolizing, to judge without needing to destroy. During those Marburg years, Arendt also had contact with other major thinkers, such as Nikolai Hartmann. But her academic journey would not stay there. Soon she left Marburg and moved to Heidelberg, where she completed her doctorate under Karl Jaspers, another existential thinker, but with an ethical and political stance much closer to what Arendt valued: responsibility, dialogue, openness to others. Still, her time with Heidegger was her true philosophical initiation. It was there she realized that philosophy is not just learned from books, it is lived. That thinking is an existential act, a way of answering the call of the world with attention and presence. That authenticity, a central concept for Heidegger, is not self-help language, but a radical demand to be faithful to one's own thinking, even when it disturbs, even when it isolates. For Arendt, authenticity would never mean retreating into oneself. She would connect it to acting in the world, to the capacity to begin something new, to respond to human plurality with freedom and responsibility. And that vision only became possible because at some point she had been confronted with a philosophy that took existence seriously. It's also important to see that, although the relationship between Arendt and Heidegger was intimate, it was also unequal in many ways. Heidegger represented tradition, male intellectual authority, academic power. Arendt, a young Jewish woman, had to cross multiple barriers just to be heard. And she did. Not by obediently following Heidegger, but by learning from him without surrendering herself to him. That is one of the greatest lessons her life offers, the importance of thinking with others, but never for them or in their place. Throughout her life, Arendt never stopped reflecting on that period. In later interviews, she avoided melodrama. She spoke of Heidegger with respect, critical distance, and a certain sadness. She knew her thinking began there, but she also knew she had gone beyond him. Her work demanded another horizon, the realm of politics, action, and freedom among people. So, between 1924 and 1929, what happened was not just a forbidden romance between professor and student. It was the awakening of a thinker. It was the moment when a young reader of Kant, marked by childhood loss, discovered that thinking is also a way of living, and that living demands authenticity. The term that Heidegger used to describe facing death and finitude, Arendt would later turn into something else, a politics of natality, not being toward death, but being capable of beginning. That shift is perhaps the deepest mark of her philosophical maturity. She took what was most profound in Heidegger and flipped it. Where he saw solitude, she saw plurality. Where he spoke of anxiety, she spoke of freedom. Where he focused on the inward self of Dasein, she opened space for the shared world. And it all began there, in crowded classrooms, secret letters, existential conversations, and silent looks that said more than words. It began with love, but a love that thought, that questioned, that transformed. It began with the awakening of a mind that would one day have the courage to say, evil becomes banal when thinking is absent. But that, of course, is another lesson. In 1929, at just 23 years old, Hannah Arendt completed her doctoral thesis at the University of Heidelberg under the supervision of Karl Jaspers. The work was titled Der Liebesbegriff bei Augustine, the concept of love in St. Augustine. It was her first systematic philosophical study, born from the intersection of Christian theology, classical philosophy, and an existential restlessness that would stay with her for life. In this seemingly academic project, we already see the core questions that would define her thought. The tension between love for the world and love for the transcendent, between politics and eternity, between living in time and longing for something absolute. Her choice of topic was not accidental. St. Augustine was not just a theological figure, he was a thinker standing at the threshold of two worlds. The collapsing classical world and the rising Christian one. A man who, like Arendt, felt the tension between a world that passes and the promise of the eternal. In studying him, Arendt was not only analyzing doctrines, she was confronting her own spiritual exile, her search for meaning, her struggle to reconcile love for the world with the desire for something beyond it. Augustine distinguishes three kinds of love. Amor amicitiae, the love of friendship. Amor concupiscentiae, the love of desire. And caritas, divine love. For him, true love is directed toward God, the eternal, unchanging, perfect being. The world, with its pleasures and bonds, is transient, deceptive, often a source of suffering. Because of this, love for earthly things is seen as disordered, and the Christian ideal becomes a movement of return to the divine source, to the absolute. Arendt enters this world with sharp sensitivity, but she notices a hidden paradox in Augustine's thought. If everything worldly is transient, how do we justify love between people, friendship, commitment to the city, responsibility toward history? If love should be directed only to the eternal, aren't we denying exactly what makes us human? Our finite condition, our ability to act in the world, to create, to love what doesn't last. This is where her reading becomes original. Arendt sees that Augustine moves between two poles, the world and God. In his writings, especially in the Confessions, he shows a divided soul, torn between attachment to worldly things and the desire for spiritual purity. This tension is not a theological flaw. It's a mirror of the human condition itself. And Arendt, with her philosophical sensitivity, understands that this conflict between amor mundi and amor Dei is never fully resolved. It shifts, survives through the centuries, and returns in different forms at the heart of modernity. She writes, "For Augustine, the essence of love is that it draws the lover out of himself toward the beloved object. Love is not introspection, but openness. But that openness is double-edged. Loving the world makes us vulnerable to loss, pain, disappointment. Loving God, on the other hand, can distance us from political life, shared responsibility, and the plurality that shapes human existence." Augustine tries to resolve this by subordinating love of the world to love of God. But Arendt quietly raises another possibility. What if the world itself is worthy of love? That question, still only implicit in her early thesis, would become the backbone of her later political philosophy. Years later, in The Human Condition, she would explicitly defend the idea of amor mundi, love for the world, for human plurality, for political action as a space of freedom. But in 1929, this was still a seed. Her study of Augustine was the fertile ground where that idea first began to grow. It is important to remember the historical context in which this thesis was written. Post-World War I. Germany was in deep crisis. The Weimar Republic was fragile, and the wounds of the war were open. Nihilism hovered over European culture. Many intellectuals turned to religion, metaphysics, or irrationalism as an escape from modern disillusionment. In this setting, Arendt's choice of Augustine takes on another meaning. She was not looking for religious comfort, but facing head-on the tension between escape and engagement, contemplation and action. There is something almost prophetic in her approach. While many around her sought meaning in dissolving the self into the absolute, Arendt was sketching another path, staying in the world despite its flaws, loving the world even when it is harsh, remaining responsible even when everything invites withdrawal. Her reading of Augustine is a critical reappropriation. She does not simply reject him. She transforms him by bringing his thought into conversation with the dilemmas of modern life. For Arendt, love is not just a feeling. It is a way of relating to others, to the world, to time itself. Divine love, focused on eternity, can lead to a rejection of time. Human love, on the other hand, is bound to what is fleeting: presence, encounter, memory. In Augustine, these two dimensions coexist in tension, and even as a young scholar, Arendt already senses that this tension cannot be erased. It can only be lived with honesty. Her thesis also reveals a method that would define her entire career: thinking with authors, not just against them. Arendt does not position herself as someone trying to tear down Augustine. She enters his language, understands his questions, shares his struggles, and from within that understanding, she exposes the limits of his perspective. This way of thinking is deeply Socratic: to understand before criticizing, to dialogue before rejecting. That is part of what makes Arendt such a unique and necessary thinker. Years later, looking back on her youth, Arendt would recognize that her thesis on Augustine marked the birth of her own independent thought. Not because she had reached final answers, but because she had learned to ask the right questions. And the main one was this: how can we love a world that is temporary, imperfect, full of conflict, and still worthy? This question runs through all her work. It appears in the Origins of Totalitarianism, when she analyzes how the destruction of public space and plurality leads to dehumanization. It returns in The Human Condition, in her defense of political action as a way of beginning anew. And it echoes in The Life of the Mind, where at the end of her life she explores thinking, willing, and judging as activities that connect us to the world, not separate us from it. Seen in retrospect, her doctoral thesis is not a minor or juvenile work. It is the starting point of a life devoted to thinking about the world without cynicism, without dogma, without resignation. In studying Augustine, Arendt learned that love is always a risk, but without it, life shrinks into empty routines. She also learned that real thinking does not pull us away from the world, it sends us back into it with greater responsibility. At just 23, writing about love, the young Hannah Arendt was already sensing something the great philosophers have always known. Philosophy may begin in wonder, but it is only fulfilled when it becomes a commitment to reality. And love, whether for God or for the world, is that force that draws us out of ourselves, pushes us toward others, and calls us to respond with courage to the fragility of existence. The year was 1933. Hannah Arendt was 27 years old and living in Germany, the country where she was born, studied, and grew intellectually. But that year, something irreversible happened, not only for history, but for her personal life. The rise of Adolf Hitler to power began turning Germany into a totalitarian machine. And for Arendt, that moment marked the end of a phase of her life. The young thinker shaped by Kant, Heidegger, and St. Augustine stopped being just a philosopher of existence. Faced with horror, she understood. It was no longer possible to be only a spectator. Shortly after, Arendt would write a sentence that summed up this turning point. Politics caught me by the throat. This was not an ideological conversion. It was an existential experience. Violence was no longer a theoretical topic. It had invaded everyday life. Nazism, with its anti-Semitic, racist, and authoritarian ideology, made it clear there was no safe place for Jews or for independent thinkers. It was the end of the illusion of intellectual neutrality. Philosophy, which had once reached toward eternal truths, now had to respond to an urgent present. The shift was radical. Until then, Arendt had focused on questions of love, being, and inward life. From this point on, the center of her thinking would be something else: the common world, politics, the space where people live together and where power appears. This was not a matter of adjusting to reality, but of active resistance. When everything pushed toward silence, she chose confrontation, with ideas, with actions, with clarity. In 1933, Hitler's regime approved the so-called law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which removed Jews from public positions. That exclusion was only the beginning. Books by Jewish authors were burned. Professors were dismissed. People started being defined not by their character or their work, but by their race. Germany was turning from a supposedly civilized nation into a state built on terror. For Hannah Arendt, this was not just old prejudice in a new form. It was a deliberate political project, designed to erase individuals, destroy plurality, and impose a totalizing ideology. Anti-Semitic persecution was a symptom of something deeper: the crisis of modern politics, the collapse of the structures that once allowed people of different backgrounds to live together. In this context, Arendt began not only to think, but to act. In Berlin, she started working secretly, collecting documents and information about the persecution of German Jews. She understood that silence could be deadly. This work, dangerous and concrete, was one of the first expressions of her philosophy in action. Yes, think, but also act. It didn't take long for her to be arrested by the Gestapo. In 1933, she was interrogated for 8 days. The imprisonment was brief, but it was enough to make one thing clear: she had to leave. Germany was no longer a place where it was possible to live with dignity. She needed to escape, and escaping meant not only leaving the country, but rebuilding her life and her thinking from the ground up. She fled to Paris using false documents, and it was in exile that Hannah Arendt began to become what the world would later recognize: a political thinker in the deepest sense. Someone who thinks with the world, about the world, and for the world. But it's worth pausing to understand how deep this shift was. Until then, Arendt's path, while not apolitical, was focused on inner life, ethics, and existential questions. Politics seemed distant, something dirty, often corrupted by ideology and power games. But seeing how the state could turn into a machine of oppression, she understood that politics is not something we can ignore. it is the way the common world is shaped or destroyed. The decision to flee was painful. Hannah left behind her homeland, her language, her teachers, her books, her memories. It was a forced break, violent, final. Exile, as she would later write, is a deep form of being uprooted. And yet, it was in exile that she found a new ground, the fight for critical thinking, for freedom, for human plurality. In Paris, Arendt began working with Jewish organizations that helped young people emigrate to Palestine. She engaged with the Jewish question, but not from a purely religious or nationalist point of view. For her, being Jewish was not a sacred essence to be protected, but a concrete historical experience, marked by centuries of exclusion, but also by cultural contribution. She began studying the roots of anti-Semitism, not as simple irrational hatred, but as a political and social construction that grew stronger in times of crisis. Those studies would later lead to her monumental book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. But in 1933, that book was still far away. What existed then was a new awareness. Evil does not always appear with a monstrous face. It can come dressed in laws, institutions, and normal routines. And real thinking only matters if it can resist this normalization. It was in this political turning point that Arendt began to shape one of the most important features of her thought, the defense of plurality. Totalitarianism is not just a harsh regime. It is, above all, the denial of the other. It destroys the public sphere, turns citizens into subjects, erases individuality. That is why, for Arendt, resisting totalitarianism is more than a moral duty. It is about what it means to be human. The turning point of 1933 also transformed how she understood freedom. Up to that moment, freedom was often seen in individual terms: choice, autonomy, personal ethics. For Arendt, it now gained another dimension. Freedom is political. It is not something you simply have inside yourself. It is something that exists when there is a public space where people can act and speak together. When that space is destroyed, freedom becomes impossible. This new idea of freedom would guide all her later work. And it all begins in this moment of rupture, when she sees that evil grows when people stop thinking, stop acting, stop speaking. Her political philosophy is born not in silence, but in flight, with her eyes on a collapsing world and a stubborn decision not to give up on humanity. The young woman who read Kant as a teenager, who studied Augustine with intensity, who loved Heidegger, was now walking on a harsher and more dangerous path, but also a more concrete one. She did not abandon philosophy. She carried it into the center of the battlefield, the political world, where truth can be twisted, where power can become oppression, but where it is still possible to act and to begin something new. And it was this realization that changed everything. I understood that I could no longer be just a spectator. When the Nazi regime consolidated its power in 1933, it wasn't just the structure of the German state that changed. The very idea of what was safe, possible, or dignified collapsed. Hannah Arendt's life, like that of millions of European Jews, became a minefield. Every step required caution. Every choice had consequences. And in this atmosphere, Arendt made a decision that would define her future. She would not stay silent. In Berlin, with no official position or institutional protection, she began helping Jewish organizations document the regime's anti-Semitic measures. Together with a small group, she collected information about repression, mass dismissals, expropriations, and the growing flood of hate speech, not only in the streets, but within the state itself. She knew that in a society sliding toward totalitarianism, thinking is already a form of resistance, but acting comes with real danger, and that danger came quickly. In 1933, Hannah Arendt was arrested by the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, because of her involvement in this investigative and support work for persecuted Jews. During 8 days of interrogation, she experienced what she would later describe as the collapse of legality. No formal charges, no rights, no guarantees, only fear, silence, and arbitrary power. The imprisonment was brief, but decisive. Arendt understood there was no room left for illusions. Germany was no longer a country ruled by law, but a machine of ideological domination. As she would later write, "Where everybody is guilty, nobody is guilty. Where everybody is suspect, nobody is free." Her release felt almost like a miracle. She was still unknown, and her youth, combined with the fact that she was a woman, may have led the Nazis to underestimate her. But she knew that mistake would not happen twice. If she stayed, she would die. And so, with the clarity of someone who understands that freedom is not just a right, but a constant decision, Arendt chose to flee Germany. With the help of friends, she crossed the border illegally into Czechoslovakia, then went on to Geneva, and finally arrived in Paris. Exiled, without proper documents, without money, without any guarantee of a future. She had entered a new territory, not only geographically, but existentially. Exile as a philosophical condition. In Paris, Arendt found something the Nazi regime tried to erase: human plurality. Refugees from different places, exiled intellectuals, political activists, Jewish thinkers. It was a fragile and fragmented world, but still alive. In that uncertain, resistant environment, she began to rebuild not only her life, but the very framework of her thinking. She started working with Zionist organizations, not out of ideological fervor, but out of solidarity. She helped organize the emigration of German Jewish youth to Palestine. Arendt did not romanticize this as a perfect national project. She saw it as a concrete way to save lives. She was skeptical of messianic nationalism, but recognized the urgency of practical solutions in a time of danger. More importantly, it was in Paris that she began forming the questions that would shape her major work, the Origins of Totalitarianism. For the first time, she started to investigate systematically the historical, social, and political roots of modern anti-Semitism. She was not satisfied with psychological or purely religious explanations. Arendt wanted to understand how centuries of anti-Jewish hatred had turned into an organized, efficient political program. To do that, she began studying the rise of nationalism, the decline of the nation-state, the expansion of European imperialism, and how all of this prepared the ground for totalitarianism. Her approach was groundbreaking. She did not treat Nazism as a mad episode or an irrational exception, but as a modern phenomenon, built out of the failures and contradictions of Western modernity itself. One of her most original insights came from this: totalitarianism is not just repression. It is a system designed to erase individuality, destroy public space, and eliminate people's capacity to judge. And it often begins with the systematic dehumanization of a chosen group, in this case, the Jews. Arendt wrote not only as a theorist, but as a witness. What she saw and lived in Paris was a preview of the collapse of European order. Anti-Semitism was no longer just a German issue. It had spread across the continent. Authoritarian movements were growing in several countries. The 1930s were a time when fear replaced coexistence, and propaganda replaced thought. Even so, Arendt refused to be paralyzed. She wrote articles, joined discussions, and moved in circles of exiled intellectuals, including Walter Benjamin, with whom she built a deep and meaningful friendship. With him, she could share the weight of exile, but also a quiet hope that thinking might still resist erasure. Paris was also where Arendt first fully understood herself as a political thinker responsible to the world. She had lost her homeland, her native language as a place of belonging, and her academic stability. Yet, paradoxically, she found there what she would later call amor mundi, love of the world. A love that does not idealize, does not deny suffering, but insists on staying present with others, in the world, despite everything. When World War II began, the situation for Jewish refugees became even more desperate. In 1940, after the German invasion of France, Arendt, as a Jewish foreigner, was arrested by French authorities and sent to the Gurs internment camp in the Pyrenees, along with thousands of other women. poor conditions, hunger, fear, uncertainty. But even there, Arendt refused to see herself only as a victim. She helped organize support networks, shared food, and tried to keep people's spirits alive. For her, thinking was also a way of caring. With help from friends, she managed to escape the camp and return to Paris, now under Nazi occupation. Staying was impossible. Once again, she had to flee. In 1941, with the support of American diplomat Hiram Bingham and journalist Varian Fry, Hannah Arendt and her husband, Heinrich Blücher, boarded a ship to the United States. That journey marked the end of a chapter defined by danger and courage. When she arrived in America, she did not come only with a suitcase and memories. She came with a task: to understand what had happened to Europe, to politics, and to the human condition, and from there, to rebuild a way of thinking up to the scale of such darkness. What Arendt lived between 1933 and 1940 was not just geographic exile. It was a spiritual passage, marked by arrest, escape, loss, but also by essential discovery. She learned that evil does not always arrive with fanfare. It advances when institutions fail, when societies fall silent, when people stop thinking. But she also learned that resistance is possible, even in camps, even in exile, even underground. She learned that thinking is a form of acting, that refusing to conform is a political act, and that the world, no matter how devastated, is still worthy of being loved. After being arrested by the Gestapo, fleeing Germany, living in exile in Paris, and facing Nazi persecution that led her to detention camps in France, Hannah Arendt finally arrived in the United States in 1941. She was exhausted, displaced, with her homeland destroyed and Europe in ruins. But she carried something few thinkers of her time had: direct experience with two modern systems of terror, Nazism and Stalinism. The philosopher who had once focused on love, existence, and Christian ethics now turned to one of the greatest intellectual challenges of the 20th century: understanding totalitarianism. Arendt was not the first to use the word totalitarianism. The term had been around since the 1920s, used to describe authoritarian regimes like Mussolini's, which boasted about controlling every aspect of Italian life. But what Arendt saw went much deeper. By examining the regimes of Hitler and Stalin, she realized this was not just another brutal dictatorship. It was something radically new, a political system that didn't simply want to rule people, but to reshape the very essence of what it means to be human. And that realization changes everything. In her analysis, which would culminate in her monumental book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951, Arendt argues that totalitarianism is not just a modern tyranny, but a new kind of domination. It doesn't just control the state, it destroys the public sphere, crushes spontaneity, and eliminates the human capacity to act freely and think critically. For Arendt, totalitarianism is a system that aims to turn entire societies into homogeneous masses with no individuality. Unlike traditional tyrannies, which repress but still leave some private space, totalitarian regimes invade everything: public life, private life, language, imagination, inner thoughts. They turn citizens into total subjects, people who don't just obey, but eventually lose the ability to think for themselves. The goal of total terror is not only to destroy human lives, but to destroy the very condition of being human, which is freedom. This is one of Arendt's most disturbing and powerful insights. Totalitarianism doesn't only kill bodies, it kills the possibility of being someone. It destroys plurality, the fact that the world is made up of different people with different opinions, perspectives, and actions. For Arendt, it is this plurality that makes real politics possible. When totalitarianism wipes it out, it destroys our shared world. In this sense, Nazism and Stalinism, despite their different ideologies, one based on racist biology, the other on a distorted vision of equality, share the same destructive core. Both create massive bureaucratic machines, build concentration and labor camps, use terror as a method, and replace reality with ideology. Arendt dives into reports, documents, testimonies. She studies the structure of Nazi camps and Soviet gulags. She sees that, in both systems, reality stops mattering. Concrete facts are replaced by absolute ideological narratives. Lies stop being exceptions and become the norm. Language is twisted until it no longer reflects the world. The result? A population that is disoriented, unable to judge, unable to act, trapped in a world where truth is whatever power decides. The consequence of this is what Arendt would later describe as the death of the human being as a moral agent. Instead of individuals who think, choose, judge, and act, totalitarianism produces isolated, fragmented masses, easy to manipulate. That's why, for Arendt, the destruction of human spontaneity is not a side effect of totalitarianism. It is its main goal. She writes, "Totalitarianism wants to dominate the whole human being. That is why it must destroy spontaneity, because spontaneity is where freedom lives." This idea, that freedom is rooted in spontaneity, is central in her thought. For Arendt, human beings are, above all, beings of action. We are free when we act in ways that are not completely predictable, when we start something new, when we break patterns and bring the unexpected into the world. Totalitarianism, by crushing this capacity, destroys what is most human in us. But what makes such a system possible? Arendt realizes that totalitarianism does not emerge out of nowhere. It feeds on conditions that already exist. Two of them are crucial: loneliness and social isolation. When people no longer feel part of a community, when they lose meaningful bonds, when they are reduced to isolated individuals, they become vulnerable to totalitarian appeals. The totalitarian leader appears as someone who offers meaning, identity, and belonging, even if the price is their freedom. Totalitarian rule is based on the isolation of individuals and on their inability to distinguish truth from falsehood. This is why Arendt insists politics is only possible where there is plurality and dialogue, where people can speak, disagree, judge, and act together. Totalitarianism hates this space. It wants absolute unity, purity, unanimity. Its enemy is not only the opposition, but anyone who thinks. The thinker is dangerous to totalitarianism, not just because they criticize the regime, but because they think at all. Hannah Arendt was one of the first to examine Nazism and Stalinism side by side. Not to say they are identical, but to show that both represent a historical mutation in how power dominates people. They are not just very harsh regimes, they are projects of social engineering with totalizing ambitions. With the Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt was not trying to write a conventional history book. She was trying to understand something unheard of, a kind of evil that didn't fit old categories, a form of domination that was not only political, but existential. Her great contribution was this: if we want to resist totalitarianism, it is not enough to remove dictators. We must protect the space where thinking is possible. This space is what she calls the public sphere, the place where people appear to one another, speak, act, disagree, and begin something new. That's why, for Arendt, freedom is not just an inner feeling. It is a political practice. And totalitarianism, by destroying this space, condemns people to silence and insignificance. Arendt's discovery of totalitarianism as a new form of domination was not just a theoretical achievement. It was her philosophical response to the most devastating experience of the 20th century. By turning her pain, exile, losses, and outrage into thought, she gave the world not only an analysis, but also a warning and a kind of hope that even in the darkest times, it is still possible to think, and by thinking, to resist. In 1941, after a desperate escape from Nazi-occupied France, Hannah Arendt arrived in the United States. She was not alone. Thousands of European refugees, many of them Jewish, were looking to America as the last refuge from the collapse of European civilization. But Arendt did not bring only luggage with her. She carried a historical trauma, a deep existential wound, and an intellectual mission. to understand how the world had reached that abyss. She had left everything behind. Her language, her homeland, her friends, some dead, some missing, others scattered in exile like her. Like so many others, Hannah had to reinvent herself in a country that was not her own. Yet, even with this brutal break from her past, one thing in her remained intact. The will to understand, to make sense of events, to give a name to what seemed unspeakable. In the United States, Arendt faced a new reality, that of being a refugee without a country. Her German passport was invalid. Officially, she was stateless. No nation recognized her as a citizen. Later, she would say this was not just a legal condition, but a deep philosophical experience. To exist without guaranteed rights, without belonging, without an institutional voice. This experience shaped her view of human rights, which she would never treat as abstract principles, but as something grounded in the ability to appear and act in the public world. At the same time, America became a place of rebuilding. With the help of intellectuals like Karl Jaspers and Raymond Aron, Arendt slowly entered the academic and cultural circles of New York. In a modest Manhattan apartment, together with her partner Heinrich Blücher, also a philosopher, also in exile, she began what would become her first major philosophical work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in 1951. Writing this book was, for Arendt, an act of intellectual survival. She was not writing for prestige or academic status. She was writing because it was necessary to understand what had happened to the world. How could Germany, the country of Kant, Goethe, Beethoven, turn into a killing machine? How could communism, born from the promise of equality, lead to a vast network of labor camps? How did the century of reason and progress end in concentration camps, gulags, and totalizing ideologies? Answering these questions required more than outrage. It demanded deep, honest, rigorous investigation. And that is what Arendt committed herself to. For nearly 10 years, she researched tirelessly, reading official reports, testimonies, history books, political manifestos. More than collecting facts, she wanted to understand. And for her, understanding meant tracing these events back to their roots. Even if those roots reached far into European history, she structured The Origins of Totalitarianism around three main parts: anti-Semitism, imperialism, and totalitarianism. In the first part, Arendt dismantles the idea that hatred of Jews was just a leftover of religious prejudice or irrational hatred. She shows how modern anti-Semitism emerged from a mix of racial theories, nationalism, and social tensions. As European Jews gained visibility in public and economic life, they became targets of resentment, conspiracy theories, and political manipulation. Hatred was not simply spontaneous, it was shaped, organized, and used. In the second part, she analyzes 19th century European imperialism. She shows how colonial expansion, especially in Africa, normalized violence, racial superiority, and rule without consent. The colonies became a testing ground for new forms of domination that would later be brought back into Europe itself. In the colonies, European powers learned how to govern masses of people without rights, and that model eventually turned inward. But it is in the third part that Arendt presents her most powerful insight: totalitarianism as a new political system, something unprecedented, with its own internal logic. Not just a more brutal version of old tyranny. Totalitarianism, for her, does not seek only power. It seeks total control over reality. It tries to rewrite history, manipulate facts, control time, erase individuality. Totalitarianism seeks to make human beings superfluous, people without initiative, without will, without uniqueness. Arendt identifies in the regimes of Hitler and Stalin an obsession with ideology, uniformity, and the destruction of human plurality. And more than that, she shows that totalitarianism feeds on loneliness, isolation, and the breakdown of social ties. A society of disconnected individuals, where people no longer trust one another and public spaces of discussion and action disappear, becomes fertile ground for totalitarian movements. For this reason, the Origins of Totalitarianism is not just a historical study, it is a philosophical warning. Arendt is clear: no society is automatically safe. Whenever there is destruction of public life, erosion of factual truth, blind worship of charismatic authority, and fear of the other, totalitarian logic can reappear in new forms, with new language, but the same destructive core. Writing this book was, for Arendt, a way of rebuilding. It was as if she were gathering the broken pieces of Europe and trying to understand how everything had shattered. It was also a way to work through thinking, the trauma of exile, persecution, and detention. And above all, it was an act of loyalty to the world, a refusal to let evil win through ignorance, denial, or forgetfulness. By the late 1940s, Arendt had become a respected voice in American intellectual life. She wrote for journals, took part in seminars, and engaged in discussions with figures like Dwight MacDonald, Mary McCarthy, and later Isaiah Berlin. But she never allowed herself to be captured by a party line or an ideology. She kept a fierce independence, rejecting easy labels and simplistic narratives. Her commitment was to thinking, and to the freedom to think. When The Origins of Totalitarianism was published in 1951, Hannah Arendt did more than release an important book. She opened a new path for political philosophy, one that begins from lived experience, does not run away from reality, and takes responsibility for the world. A philosophy that does not try to predict the future, but tries to understand the past, so the present is not swallowed by darkness. Her journey from Nazi Germany to democratic America was not only a geographic movement. It was the journey from witness to thinker, from survivor to analyst, from exiled woman to one of the clearest minds of her time. And all of this is condensed in a work that remains relevant, because totalitarianism, though defeated on the battlefield, still haunts the foundations of freedom in many subtle and renewed forms. Arendt understood, perhaps better than anyone, that thinking is a powerful form of resistance, and that rebuilding thought after catastrophe is not a luxury. It is a deeply political act, maybe the most political of all. When Hannah Arendt published The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, she didn't just offer an explanation of the recent past. She drew a philosophical and political map of the crisis of modernity, showing how totalitarianism, far from being a random event or isolated aberration, was the end result of a long process of erosion of the structures that had supported Western civilization for centuries: religion, the nation-state, and legitimate authority. Her book is not built as a simple chain of causes and effects. Instead, Arendt presents an anatomy of collapse. She divides the work into three major parts: anti-Semitism, imperialism, and totalitarianism, which function as interconnected stages of a broader crisis that unfolds throughout the 19th century and explodes in the 20th. Anti-Semitism was not new. Persecution of Jews dates back to antiquity and intensified in the Middle Ages, especially under Christian Europe. But as Arendt shows, modern anti-Semitism cannot be understood only as religious prejudice or ancient hatred. It is political, structural, and deeply tied to social and economic changes. In the 19th century, as Jews gained civil rights and entered public and economic life, they also became targets of new forms of hostility. Paradoxically, Jewish emancipation, a product of the Enlightenment and liberal revolutions, fueled resentment among groups who felt threatened by this new visibility. The Jew began to be portrayed as a symbol of everything modernity was destroying: stability, tradition, national homogeneity. Arendt examines how the figure of the social pariah, the stateless cosmopolitan Jew linked to finance, was constructed and used as a scapegoat in times of crisis. Anti-Semitism became a political tool, no longer just religious rejection, but a deliberate instrument used by frustrated elites to mobilize and manipulate the masses. The rise of political anti-Semitism marks the moment when hatred became a conscious tool for building power. For Arendt, modern anti-Semitism was the first clear sign of a collapsing order. Religion no longer held society together. The nation-state was beginning to crack. The individual, stripped of real community, became easy prey for simplistic explanations. The Jew became a convenient answer for a vague sense of fear. And wherever fear replaces understanding, the ground for hatred is ready. If anti-Semitism was the first symptom, European imperialism was the rehearsal for what would later become totalitarianism. In the 19th century, European powers launched themselves into the conquest of Africa and Asia, driven by a mix of economic ambition, racial arrogance, and belief in progress. Arendt argues that imperialism was not only about gaining territory, it transformed how power itself worked. In the colonies, concepts like citizenship, rights, and responsibility were replaced by a brutal logic of domination, exploitation, and control over entire populations. For the first time, people were managed as masses instead of individuals. Based on racial hierarchies, colonial systems excluded the other from the realm of politics and morality. Arendt saw this as a dark preview of what would later happen inside Europe. Imperialism destroyed the line between domination and exploitation, between violence and authority, between politics and mere administration. Imperialism also helped undermine the nation-state. By projecting power outward, European countries weakened their own internal cohesion. Citizenship meant less. Politics became technical management and expansion strategy. The bond between people, territory, and law, central to the modern state, began to dissolve. By the end of the 19th century, Europe had eaten away at its own political foundations without building anything solid in their place. The stage was set for something new and dangerous. For Arendt, totalitarianism is not just an extreme version of imperialism or anti-Semitism. It is the result of a complete breakdown of the moral, political, and institutional categories of modern Western society. In the regimes of Hitler and Stalin, she identifies a new form of power never seen before. A power that doesn't just want obedience, but wants to reshape reality itself, to remake human beings according to an absolute ideological blueprint. This kind of regime stands on three main pillars: a totalizing ideology. Whether Nazi racial doctrine or Stalinist revolutionary mythology, these ideologies allow no doubt, no questions, no opposition. They replace facts with doctrine and turn politics into fate. Permanent terror, not occasional repression, but a stable system of fear, surveillance, denunciation, arbitrary punishment, and physical elimination of enemies of the people. And these enemies are defined not by what they do, but by who they are. Dehumanizing bureaucracy. The totalitarian state functions through administrative machinery that turns evil into routine work. The worst crimes are carried out by people just doing their job, an insight that would later shape Arendt's idea of the banality of evil. Totalitarianism tries to create a world in which human beings are superfluous, where everything is replaceable, where there is no longer any space for acting, thinking, or judging. Well, what emerges from her analysis is a devastating picture of the 20th century, a modernity that, after losing its anchors, God, nation, law, drifted into the hands of movements promising total meaning, total order, total purity. But Arendt is not just mourning the ruins. She is searching within them for what is still alive, the remaining possibilities of freedom and responsibility. The crisis of modernity, collapse or chance. By tracing this path, from anti-Semitism to imperialism, and from imperialism to totalitarianism, Arendt shows that the real danger is not only in extremist ideologies themselves, but in the slow, silent erosion of the institutions that sustain a shared world. What is at stake is not only the survival of political regimes, but the human condition itself, our ability to act, to speak, to judge, to share a plural world, and that ability only survives where there is freedom, responsibility, and institutions that recognize the dignity of each person. So, the origins of totalitarianism is not just an explanation of the past. It is a call to vigilance. Arendt teaches that totalitarianism begins long before open terror. It starts with contempt for truth, with indifference to politics, with the loss of dialogue, with silence in the face of injustice. She calls us to resist, not only explicit authoritarianism, but the comfort of indifference, the pull of conformity, and the decay of honest language. In a world where populism, denialism, and hate speech keep resurfacing with new masks, Arendt's lesson remains clear and alive. Thinking is dangerous, but not thinking is fatal. The end of World War II in 1945 didn't bring immediate relief. The world came out of the ruins with open wounds, both visible and invisible. The concentration camps had been liberated, but the horror of what was found there still echoed everywhere. Across Europe, cities were destroyed, and in people's hearts and minds, one question kept coming back: how was this possible? Living in the United States since 1941, Hannah Arendt faced the post-war moment not as a distant observer, but as someone who had lived persecution, exile, and imprisonment. She had narrowly escaped the totalitarian machine, but she did not escape the responsibility to think about what it all meant. Out of this sense of responsibility, ethical, political, and philosophical, she began to shape a crucial question. What is the political? This was not just an academic problem. Arendt knew that totalitarianism had not risen only through brute force. It had grown in the empty space left by the depoliticization of modern societies. Where there had once been public debate, there was now propaganda. Where there had been plurality, there was forced unanimity. Where there had been action, there was apathy. So what had been lost? What does it really mean to act politically? Throughout the 1950s, this question became the center of her thinking. Arendt, who had already taken apart the origins of totalitarianism, now wanted to understand what needed to be defended, rebuilt, or reinvented so that politics would not once again become a space of death, repression, and silence. She turned back to the classics of political thought, especially the ancient Greeks, but instead of repeating traditional interpretations, she did something different. She read them through the lens of modern experience, and there, in the life of the Athenian polis, she found a key idea. Politics, in its original sense, is the space of freedom. This wasn't just a pretty phrase. For Arendt, freedom was not simply the opposite of necessity, nor just the individual right to make private choices. Political freedom meant the ability to appear before others, to speak, to act, to begin something new in a shared world. Freedom is not a gift, but an experience that happens between people when they act together. This idea of freedom as public action goes against much of the Western philosophical tradition, especially thinkers like Plato, Hobbes, and Rousseau, who tended to see politics mainly as a tool to control disorder or organize power. For Arendt, that way of thinking turns politics into mere management and reduces action to obedience or administration. And it was exactly this emptying out of the political, she argues, that helped create space for totalitarianism in the 20th century. That's why her question, what is the political, is not standard theory. It's an attempt to recover the lost meaning of politics as the sphere of freedom, plurality, and spontaneous action. Arendt begins to defend a radically non-utilitarian view of politics. Politics, for her, is not valuable because it serves some external goal, security, wealth, order. It has value in itself as the space where human beings can appear, speak, act, and show who they are. Just as an artist reveals themselves through their work, a person reveals their political self through words and deeds. From this standpoint, politics is not the natural place of violence. In fact, violence shows up when politics fails. Real politics demands presence, courage, responsibility, and a willingness to live with differences. Plurality is not a problem to be solved, it is the heart of public life. We can act politically only because we are different from one another. Equality in politics does not mean sameness. It means mutual recognition among distinct individuals. The human condition of action is plurality, the fact that we are all the same, yet each of us is distinct. But this plurality had been crushed in the decades before. Totalitarianism demanded uniformity. Public language had been replaced by slogans. Debate became a crime. The we of a people was hijacked by racial, national, and ideological myths. The result was the destruction of the public sphere itself, the very space Arendt saw as essential for freedom. So, in the 1950s, her thinking doesn't stop at condemning past horrors. She also looks ahead. Arendt sees a new danger rising: political apathy. Not imposed by terror this time, but produced by indifference, comfort, and the bureaucratization of public life. Freedom was now at risk not only from open repression, but from citizens walking away from politics altogether. Rebuilding political thought, for Arendt, meant restoring the value of acting, speaking, and meeting in public. It meant rethinking what it is to be a citizen. A citizen, in her view, is not just someone who receives public services or votes from time to time. A citizen is someone who acts with others, speaks up, participates, and helps take care of a shared world. That's why her question, what is the political, hits so hard. It pushes us out of cynicism, alienation, and passivity. It reminds us that the world does not take care of itself. It has to be maintained, protected, renewed by the people who live in it. Arendt also insisted on distinguishing the political from the social. While many modern thinkers blurred the line, she argued that politics is not simply where material needs are managed. That belongs more to the social and economic realm: labor, work, consumption. The political realm is where freedom appears, where people come together to act, to speak, to begin something new. This distinction is central to her critique of the bureaucratic state. When politics is reduced to technical management, it loses its creative power. The political sphere turns into administration, and the citizen turns into a spectator. Over the course of the 1950s, these reflections would take shape in her major work, The Human Condition, 1958, where Arendt develops her famous distinctions between labor, work, and action, and defends political action as the highest expression of human freedom. But it all starts with that basic question she asked herself after the war: what is the political? And that question still confronts us today. In an age marked by polarization, online aggression, trivialized politics, and growing authoritarian tendencies in many countries, Arendt's thought becomes urgent again. She reminds us that politics is not war by other means, nor just a stage for egos and propaganda. At its best, politics is the space of human freedom, where we act among equals and show who we are. It is the realm of responsibility, dialogue, and new beginnings. This idea she cherished so deeply, seeing in every human being the capacity to start something new in the world. With the birth of each child, the world is once again called to hope. In the post-war ruins, material and spiritual, Hannah Arendt dared to ask what should be saved, and she taught us that when we talk about politics, we are not just talking about power for its own sake, but about the dignity of being human. In 1958, Hannah Arendt published The Human Condition, perhaps her most dense, ambitious, and original work. Written in a moment when Western political thought was trying to rebuild itself, the book doesn't just analyze regimes or power structures. Its goal is deeper, to understand what it means to be human in the modern world. Unlike many philosophers of her time, Arendt doesn't start with systems, laws, or institutions. She starts from the concrete experience of human life and tries to reconstruct, from its most basic forms to its highest expressions, how human beings live, survive, and transform the world they inhabit. At the center of her analysis is a three-part distinction that became fundamental to her thought: labor, work, and action. Three different ways of relating to life, the world, and other people, each with its own value, limits, and meaning. The first activity is labor, animal laborans. This is the most basic and unavoidable dimension of existence, the constant repetition of tasks tied to maintaining biological life: eating, sleeping, cleaning, caring for the body, raising children. It is the realm of necessity, of effort that never really ends. Labor is tied to the cyclical nature of organic life. Every need that is satisfied comes back again. We get hungry every day. We need sleep every night. It is the endless cycle of survival. Arendt stresses that this kind of life is not inferior. It is essential. It keeps us alive. But she warns, when labor becomes the center of human life, we risk reducing existence to mere survival, to the endless satisfaction of basic needs and desires. In that condition, freedom disappears. In the modern world, she says, there is a kind of cult of comfort, consumption, and well-being that often turns human beings into nothing more than producers and consumers of needs. Time is swallowed up by the urge to satisfy demands. Freedom, which needs room and time for something new, gets suffocated by the routines of survival. The second activity is work, homo faber. Unlike labor, which deals with natural repetition, work is about making durable things, artificial objects that break with nature's cycle, tools, houses, books, cities, works of art. Work creates what Arendt calls the human world, an artificial space between us and nature, where we live and through which we relate to one another. Work is instrumental. It aims at an end, at producing something. It requires planning, technique, and practical reasoning. For Arendt, work is one of the things that distinguishes humans from animals. It allows us to step beyond the raw cycle of nature and build a more stable and lasting reality, a world where action can take place. But that stability also brings a danger, turning everything into a thing. When everything is seen as a tool, something to be made, used, and thrown away, the world becomes just a means to an end. And humans start to see themselves the same way, as resources, instruments, useful objects. This danger grows stronger with the advance of technology and bureaucracy. In modern societies, Arendt notes, human activity is more and more absorbed into the logic of production and efficiency. The value of things and people is measured by usefulness. Work starts to invade every part of life, turning even thinking and education into products. It's at this point that Arendt introduces her third and highest category, action, praxis. For her, action is the real core of political life. It is through action that human beings appear to one another, start something new, and show who they are. Unlike labor and work, action is not driven by necessity and is not fully guided by predictable ends. It is open, uncertain, and always involves other people. It is the space of freedom, plurality, and the unexpected. Action is the one miracle that human beings can perform. In action, we become visible, not just as holders of roles or functions, but as unique individuals. Arendt sees this in public debates, political movements, and encounters between different people. Action is always relational. It needs a common world, a public space where words and gestures matter. In this sense, politics is not administration and not just a technology of governing. Politics is the space of human action, where a shared reality is built, where meaning is contested, where the new can begin. And that is why it is essential for freedom. The problem, Arendt argues, is that in modern societies, action has been gradually suffocated. First by the dominance of necessity, labor, then by the logic of production, work. Finally, by the rise of bureaucratic politics, where spontaneity, speech, debate, and disagreement are treated as obstacles to efficiency. For Arendt, totalitarianism was the most extreme form of destroying action. In totalitarian regimes, people are prevented from acting freely, speaking freely, or beginning anything on their own. They are turned into parts of a machine. But even in modern democracies, the danger remains. When politics turns into a show or into pure technical management, it stops being a space of freedom and becomes just another system of functions. One of the most powerful images in the human condition is that of the world as a space between people. This space is not only physical, it is symbolic, ethical, political. It is the place where we can act with one another without merging into one mass and without erasing our differences. It is the space of plurality, where each person can appear as unique, but always in relation to others. This shared world, for Arendt, is always at risk, from authoritarianism, but also from apathetic individualism. It can only survive if there are people willing to speak, to act, to show up, to take responsibility. So her distinction between labour, work and action is not just a theoretical exercise. It is a diagnosis of the modern crisis. A warning: we are forgetting action, losing the public space, giving up our freedom, not only because we are oppressed, but because we settle for comfort and passivity. The title, The Human Condition, is revealing. Arendt is not talking about human nature in the traditional sense. She is talking about the conditions, the surrounding world, the institutions, the relationships that shape how we can exist as human beings. And those conditions are not fixed. They are contested, created, and at risk. Politics, freedom, action, the common world, none of this is guaranteed. All of it can disappear, and Arendt had seen exactly that in the first half of the 20th century. But she had also seen that the capacity to act, to begin, to come together, to resist, that capacity is never completely destroyed. That is why her work is both tragic and hopeful. Tragic because it sees clearly the real dangers threatening freedom. Hopeful because it insists that as long as there are human beings, there is always the possibility of beginning something new. Men, though they must die, are not born to die, but to begin. That line from Arendt rings out like a call. Not a call to utopia or blind revolution, but a call to the responsibility of keeping the space of action alive. And with it, the deepest meaning of politics, to be free among others and to build together the world we share. In 1961, Hannah Arendt found herself at another decisive turning point in her intellectual and personal journey. The world was closely watching the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the main organizers of the logistics behind the final solution, the Nazi plan to exterminate Europe's Jews. Captured in Argentina by the Israeli Secret Service and brought to Jerusalem, Eichmann now stood before the court of the State of Israel and of history. Arendt was invited by The New Yorker to cover the trial as a reporter. More than just a journalistic assignment, this trip was a symbolic return. A Jewish exile going back to the center of a collective wound to observe, think, and bear witness. What she found there, however, would shock the world and deeply affect how many people, especially in the Jewish community, saw her. The expectation was that Eichmann would appear as a monster. He had been responsible for organizing the deportation of millions of Jews to extermination camps. People imagined someone overtly cruel, cold, demonic. But when Arendt saw him sitting in the glass booth in court, she noticed something profoundly disturbing. There was nothing monstrous about him. The truly frightening thing about Eichmann is that he was terribly normal. This observation, which became the basis of her idea of the banality of evil, was not a provocation, but a philosophical conclusion. Eichmann didn't seem driven by burning hatred or deep ideological belief. He presented himself as a mediocre man, loyal to his career, who claimed he had simply been following orders. During the testimonies, Eichmann used clichés, bureaucratic jargon, and technical excuses. He talked about deadlines, transport, and logistics as if he were discussing a business operation, not the mass murder of millions. Arendt was struck by his lack of real thought, his inability to grasp the moral weight of his actions. She realized that evil, contrary to what many would like to believe, does not always require monstrous rage or sadistic cruelty. It can arise from blind obedience, thoughtlessness, and efficient bureaucracy. From this, she developed one of her most controversial claims. Evil is not always radical. It can be shallow. It can take root where thinking is absent. Her reports were later published in 1963 as Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. The reaction was explosive. Many accused Arendt of minimizing Nazi crimes, blaming the victims, or betraying the Jewish people. But her goal was different. She wanted to show that the true danger is not only in fanatical monsters, but in ordinary people who give up moral responsibility. Arendt's reading broke a certain moral comfort. If Eichmann was not a demonic exception, but a dull, obedient bureaucrat, then evil was not safely far away. It could appear inside systems, in offices, among normal people. The trial also brought out another central problem for Arendt: the crisis of moral judgment in the modern world. Eichmann did not seem to see himself as guilty. He insisted he had followed orders, been part of a machine, had no real choice. He hid behind the language of duty and hierarchy. For Arendt, obedience does not erase responsibility. The ability to judge, to reflect on what we are doing, to imagine the consequences of our actions, this is at the core of human dignity. Eichmann's guilt, in her view, was not based on inner hatred, but on his refusal to think. Thinking is a silent dialogue with ourselves. Eichmann had stopped having that dialogue. This kind of reflection made people uncomfortable. It is easier to imagine evil as something alien to everyday life, something inhuman. It is much harder to accept that evil can grow out of moral laziness, ethical cowardice, and the refusal to think for oneself. By refusing to treat Eichmann as a mythic monster and portraying him instead as a conformist functionary, Arendt forced a brutal question onto her readers. What would you have done in his place? The anger toward Arendt grew stronger when she mentioned, even briefly, the role of some Jewish councils, Judenräte, during the Holocaust. In some cases, these councils, under extreme coercion, helped organize lists and logistics, hoping to save at least part of their communities. Arendt did not simply condemn them, but she raised the painful question of what happens to moral choices under total domination. For many, that was unbearable. It sounded like she was blaming Jews for their own destruction. But Arendt's real aim was to explore the extreme moral dilemmas produced by totalitarian systems, to ask what happens to judgment when all normal standards of law, protection, and freedom collapse. At the end of the trial, Eichmann was sentenced to death and executed in 1962. Arendt agreed with the verdict. He was guilty, not because he burned with hatred, but because he willingly took part in a system that treated human beings as cargo to be eliminated. More than a legal report, Eichmann in Jerusalem became a deep meditation on evil in the modern world, on responsibility, and on the danger of unthinking obedience. Arendt was not trying to shock for its own sake. She was trying to understand. And in doing so, she offered one of the most disturbing insights of the 20th century. Evil can come with a tidy desk, polite manners, and a clean uniform. That insight demands something from us that Arendt saw as essential: the constant practice of critical thinking. Not just academic thinking, but ethical thinking, examining, questioning, judging, refusing to switch off our conscience. Thinking prevents us from being merely instruments in the hands of any external power. The Eichmann trial became a harsh mirror. In it, Arendt saw what happens when people abandon the freedom to judge, when individuals give up conscience in the name of obedience, when evil becomes so normalized that it looks like just another administrative task. This experience deeply shaped the next phase of her work. From then on, Arendt turned more and more to what she called the life of the mind, thinking, willing, judging, trying to understand how we can protect moral dignity in a world where evil doesn't appear only in the figure of tyrants, but also in the conformity of ordinary people. By covering the Eichmann trial, Hannah Arendt didn't just write a book. She held up a mirror to the human condition, and in that mirror, we saw something we would rather not see. That evil sometimes looks ordinary, and its essence is the refusal to think. When Hannah Arendt attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, she wasn't expecting a philosophical breakthrough. She expected, like most people, to see confirmed the common belief that the crimes of Nazism had been carried out by vicious fanatics driven by extreme cruelty. But what she found in the courtroom was something very different and deeply unsettling. Eichmann was not a monster. He He wasn't a sadist, a psychopath, or a demon in human form. He was simply an obedient bureaucrat, an ordinary man unable to think critically about what he was doing. That shock became the starting point for one of the most disturbing ideas of the 20th century, the concept of the banality of evil. The phrase does not mean that evil is small or unimportant. It points to something even more terrifying. Evil can appear when people stop thinking. For Arendt, not thinking is not the same as being ignorant. It is the absence of moral reflection, the refusal or inability to have an inner conversation with oneself before acting. Evil can become banal when a person refuses to think about what they are doing. Eichmann, the man who helped organize the deportation of millions of Jews to extermination camps, did not seem driven by burning hatred or pleasure in killing. He kept repeating that he was just following orders, obeying the law, doing his job. That kind of justification, that sounds bureaucratic on the surface, is exactly what Arendt saw as the core of the problem, turning evil into routine, crime into procedure, mass murder into office work. For Arendt, thinking is what keeps us from committing atrocities. Not thinking in a technical or academic sense, but in a moral and existential sense. Thinking as the silent inner dialogue, as Socrates described it. The ability to ask oneself, can I live with myself after doing this? Thinking, for her, is the inner space where moral conscience is formed. When that space disappears, a person becomes vulnerable to blind obedience. They stop being a moral agent and become an instrument, a cog in a system that no longer distinguishes right from wrong. Eichmann did not think, and it was this inability to think that made him capable of doing evil. This was a bold and unsettling claim. Arendt shifted the discussion of evil away from psychology and theology, where evil is treated as sickness or sin, and into the realm of moral thinking. Evil, she suggested, is not always the result of a corrupted nature, but of the failure to judge, the collapse of inner reflection. That is why she said evil can be banal, not because it is harmless, but because it can be committed without depth, without awareness, without demonic intention. Evil can slip into normal life. It arises from inertia and conformity. The lesson Arendt draws from Eichmann goes far beyond Nazi Germany. She saw in him a universal warning about the danger of obedience without moral judgment, a danger that can return whenever people and institutions give up critical thinking in the name of authority. Totalitarianism, in her view, succeeds when people stop thinking, when they prefer the safety of obedience over the risk of reflection, when orders feel more comfortable than judgment. Eichmann insisted he never acted on his own, that he obeyed the laws of the Reich, that he had no choice. For Arendt, this kind of excuse exposes the core crisis of modern morality: personal judgment replaced by impersonal rules and bureaucratic chains of command. She saw that modern societies often spread responsibility so thin that no one feels accountable. Everything is done in the name of something: the law, the nation, the company, progress. That's how evil becomes less visible. It hides inside systems, routines, procedures, until it looks normal. Eichmann did not need to hate Jews personally to help destroy them. He accepted the machine that killed them and worked diligently to keep it running. That is what makes him so frightening. Evil stops looking exceptional. It becomes ordinary, mechanical, managed. What struck me in Eichmann was the absence of depth. It was as if evil had entered the world without roots, without thought, without conviction. For Arendt, thinking is a form of resistance. Thinking is dangerous because it interrupts blind obedience. It forces us to pause, to question, to feel the weight of our choices. That is why totalitarian systems fear thinking. They need people who execute, not people who reflect. And this is also why Arendt insists thinking is a political act, not in the sense of party politics, but as the act that keeps our ability to judge and act responsibly alive. When thinking is replaced by ideology, judgment disappears. Ideology hands out ready-made answers, erases inner conflict, divides the world into simple opposites. Us versus them, good versus evil, loyal versus enemy. Trapped in Nazi ideology, Eichmann had lost the ability to think beyond those categories. Arendt argues that the real danger of the modern world is not just fanaticism, but emptiness. A vacuum of thought where conscience falls silent and action becomes automatic, and it is in that vacuum that evil grows. The banality of evil is also a diagnosis of modern life. We live in complex systems, where each person often performs a small task in a large process they barely see. This fragmentation of responsibility creates ideal conditions for evil to hide behind duties and job descriptions. A bureaucrat signs a paper, a guard follows a rule, an employee applies a policy. Each one can say, "I was just doing my job," but together, they may be helping to sustain injustice or violence. Arendt saw in this the great danger revealed by the 20th century, people becoming functionaries of evil, not because they are monsters, but because they don't think morally about what they do. So, the banality of evil is a warning about our own vulnerability. None of us is completely safe from it. Every time we obey without questioning, every time we avoid asking whether something is right, every time we trade conscience for comfort or loyalty to the system, we open a door. To clarify this, Arendt returns to Socrates, whom she admired deeply. Socrates said it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it, because committing injustice damages the integrity of the self. For Arendt, this is the core of ethics, the ability to live with oneself. Whoever refuses to think becomes unable to live at peace with themselves. Thinking, then, is not just an intellectual exercise. It is what protects our humanity. It keeps us from becoming strangers to ourselves. It is what keeps us responsible, the antidote to the banality of evil. In forming this concept, Arendt was not excusing Eichmann. On the contrary, she held him fully guilty, precisely because he could have thought and chose not to, and that is the sharpest edge of her insight. Thinking is a moral duty. Not thinking is also a choice, and one with devastating consequences. Banal evil is not the evil of monsters, but of the obedient, of those who follow orders without judgment, who hide behind roles, titles, systems, who say, "I had no choice." By revealing the banality of evil, Hannah Arendt holds up an uncomfortable mirror. In it, we see that the greatest danger does not lie only at the extremes, but also in everyday mediocrity, passivity, conformity, and indifference. Maybe the greatest danger to the world is not the monsters, but those who stop thinking. This is Arendt's legacy, an ethics of thinking, a call to resist blind obedience, to keep alive the inner dialogue that supports moral judgment. Because in the end, evil becomes possible when people stop asking the simplest and most human question of all: is this right? Hannah Arendt's philosophy was born out of a wounded age, and her thinking is, in many ways, a response to the moral collapse brought about by war, totalitarianism, concentration camps, and the banality of evil. Faced with a century in which the worst crimes were carried out by seemingly ordinary people who were just following orders, Arendt felt forced to rethink what had long supported Western ethics: moral judgment. How did people reach a point where they no longer distinguished right from wrong? How did the capacity to judge, to think responsibly, disappear so quietly? These questions had been with her since her analysis of the Eichmann case. But it was in the final stage of her life, especially in her unfinished writings collected under the title The Life of the Mind, that she tried to give them a deeper philosophical answer. To do this, she turned back to Immanuel Kant. Arendt believed we live in a time marked by a breakdown of traditional moral reference points. The great institutions, religion, the state, patriarchal authority, no longer provide absolute, unquestioned answers. Good and evil are no longer guaranteed by external dogmas or fixed rules. She doesn't see this loss as purely negative. For Arendt, it's ambiguous. On one hand, the collapse of traditional authorities creates confusion, insecurity, and moral relativism. On the other, it opens space for individual responsibility, for a kind of judgment that is no longer based on blind obedience, but on the exercise of autonomous thinking. The crisis of moral judgment, then, is the crisis of a world where duty alone is no longer enough. A world in which each person must be able to judge for themselves without handing that task over to authorities, traditions, or collective habits. But how can we judge in such a world? Where do ethical criteria come from when the old ground has disappeared? To confront this, Arendt doesn't go to Kant's better-known moral works, like the Critique of Practical Reason with its famous categorical imperative. Instead, she turns to the less explored Critique of Judgment. And there she finds a new way of thinking about judgment in modern times. What interests her is Kant's idea of reflective judgment, especially as it appears in aesthetic experience. For example, when we judge something to be beautiful without having a fixed rule that tells us so. According to Kant, in this kind of judgment, we don't apply a ready-made law. We use imagination and sensitivity to reach a judgment that is subjective, but still claims a kind of general validity. When I say this is beautiful, I'm not only stating a private taste, I'm assuming that others could agree with me if they saw what I see. Arendt takes this idea and brings it into the moral realm. Ethical judgment, like aesthetic judgment, doesn't depend only on strict rules, but on the ability to think from the standpoint of others, what she calls enlarged mentality, erweiterte Denkungsart. This enlarged mentality is key to moral judgment in Arendt's view. It is the capacity to step out of our own narrow position and try to see the world from different perspectives. It's not about emotional empathy, but about critical imagination. Being able to think with the minds of others, to consider multiple viewpoints before acting, to see ourselves as one among many, not as the center of the universe. The faculty of judgment depends on the ability to think from the standpoint of someone else. And Hannah Arendt, The Life of the Mind. This ability is deeply political. Judgment is never completely private. It is formed with an audience in mind, real or imagined. To judge is to ask, how will this look in the eyes of others? And, through that, to take responsibility for what we do. In the Eichmann case, Arendt saw that his core moral failure was not hatred, but the total absence of this kind of thinking. He was unable, or unwilling, to imagine what his actions meant for the people affected by them. His obedience was not ethical, it was mechanical, and that made him dangerous. Putting yourself in someone else's place is not a sentimental slogan. For Arendt, it requires discipline and the willingness to interrupt automatic behavior. Thinking before acting is hard, slow, and uncomfortable. But it is what prevents us from becoming unthinking collaborators in unjust systems. Moral judgment, then, is not an abstract function. It is an act of being present in the world. It is the moment we refuse to act as mere functionaries and accept responsibility for our choices. This becomes even more urgent in times when evil hides behind normality. When evil becomes banal, as Arendt wrote about Eichmann, it is precisely because people have stopped judging. When judgment disappears, anything becomes possible, including the worst crimes. For Arendt, moral judgment is rooted in our relationship to a shared world. That is why language, especially dialogue, matters so much. Talking with others, hearing different views, arguing, disagreeing, all of this strengthens our capacity to judge. Enlarged judgment is forged in plurality. It comes from recognizing that we share the world with others who see differently than we do. To think morally is already to act politically. It is to accept that our decisions affect more than just ourselves. The crisis of moral judgment deepens, she argues, whenever society looks for one single formula to solve complex moral problems. When choices are handed over to rigid ideologies, algorithms, or impersonal rules that claim to remove the need for thinking. In those moments, morality dissolves into conformity. Arendt insists there is no ready-made formula for judgment. Every situation demands reflection, context, listening, and sensitivity. Good cannot simply be decreed. It appears in the living encounter between thought and reality. That's why she warns against replacing judgment with rule following. Rules matter, of course, but without judgment, rules can be followed blindly, and history has already shown how dangerous that is. When Arendt reflects on moral judgment, she is not giving us a new moral code. She is offering something harder and more necessary, an invitation to responsible thinking, a call not to let the crisis of morality turn into abandonment of conscience. To judge, in Arendt's sense, is to reject indifference. It is to keep alive the ability to say, this is unjust, this I will not do, even when everyone else stays silent. We are free to act, but we are also free not to act. This is the power of judgment. To stop an action when it becomes dangerous, even if it is legal. To break obedience when it becomes inhuman, even if it is ordered. In an age of polarization, hate speech, automated decisions, and collapsing dialogue, Arendt's idea of enlarged judgment is more relevant than ever. She reminds us that freedom begins in thought, and that thinking is not a luxury, but a civic duty. Today, the crisis of moral judgment is not just a philosophical issue, it is a political survival issue. In a world where people obey without reflecting, judge without listening, and act without considering others, evil finds fertile ground. That is why Arendt calls us to practice judgment, to exercise critical thinking, to cultivate moral imagination, not to become perfect, but to remain human in the deepest sense, capable of judging, acting, and taking responsibility for what we choose. Throughout her life and work, Hannah Arendt faced the darkest sides of the 20th century: wars, totalitarian regimes, mass extermination, the destruction of politics, and the collapse of responsibility. In a morally shattered world, she wasn't interested only in diagnosing what went wrong. She also wanted to recover examples of lucid humanity, free thinking, and ethical resistance. And she found her clearest model of the thinking citizen in an ancient figure, Socrates. For Arendt, Socrates was not just the founder of Western philosophy. He was the clearest symbol of a life lived with responsibility, moral coherence, and an unshakable commitment to think for oneself. In a city that demanded order and stability, Socrates chose questioning, doubt, conversation, and above all, loyalty to his own conscience, even when it cost him his life. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a city in crisis. It had gone through wars, defeats, internal conflicts. Democracy, once celebrated, showed its weaknesses. The sophists taught people how to win arguments, not how to seek truth. Public speech was turning into manipulation. The trial of Socrates, accused of corrupting the youth and not respecting the city's gods, became a symbol of intolerance toward free thought. Arendt saw in that Athens a mirror of the modern world. The same fear of thought that appeared in the condemnation of Socrates also appeared, in another way, in the world that produced Eichmann. In both cases, what was at stake was not just legal order, but the freedom to judge for oneself, to question senseless norms, to keep an inner dialogue even when the crowd demands silence. For Arendt, Socrates was killed because he thought, and because he taught others to think. A central idea in Arendt's reading of Socrates is inner dialogue. Drawing from Plato's dialogues, she understands thinking as a silent conversation between me and myself. When Socrates says that an unexamined life is not worth living, he is saying that to live without thinking is to live blindly, without ethics, without freedom, without real humanity. Thinking means being in company with oneself. Hannah Arendt. But this company, Arendt adds, is only possible if I can live with myself. If my actions shame me, if I betray my own conscience, I become a stranger to myself, and living with that inner split becomes unbearable. Moral judgment is born there. I act not only in front of others, but also in front of myself. Socrates refused to become complicit in injustice. In court, he refused to flatter the judges or lie to save his life. He chose to die rather than act against what he believed was right. His famous idea, It is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, becomes for Arendt the basic ethical principle of the thinking citizen. What Arendt admired most in Socrates was his way of living in the world. He didn't write treatises, didn't build philosophical systems, didn't seek fame or power. He walked through the city, talked to ordinary people, asked uncomfortable questions. He practiced philosophy as living dialogue, a shared search for truth, and a constant pushback against dogmatic ignorance. This attitude is very close to Arendt's idea of what politics should be: a public space where people appear to one another, speak, listen, argue, and act. Socrates was not a politician in the official sense, but his life was deeply political. He lived out in the open, with others, refusing silence and neutrality. His death was not just a personal tragedy, it was the consequence of a choice to put thinking above survival. For Arendt, that radical loyalty to conscience is exactly the model modern people need, especially in times when so many hide behind obedience. Socrates teaches us that the greatest evil is not to die, but to lose one's soul. Arendt. After the Eichmann trial, Arendt became even more focused on moral judgment. How could ordinary people take part in extermination without doubt or remorse? Her answer pointed again to the same place: the collapse of thinking, the silence of inner dialogue. So she turned back to Socrates, because he represents the exact opposite of Eichmann. Eichmann said, "I was just following orders." Socrates said, "I cannot act against what I believe is just." Eichmann ran from responsibility. Socrates took full responsibility, even unto death. Eichmann was unable to reflect. Socrates lived in constant reflection. For Arendt, Socrates is proof that it is possible to keep moral integrity even under social pressure, unjust laws, or threat of punishment. He shows that you can and must say no when law turns against justice. Responsibility, he reminds us, cannot be handed over to the state, the boss, or tradition. It is always personal. Arendt believed politics only truly exists where there is plurality, where different people meet, talk, and act together. Socrates was not a lawgiver, but he created a space in between himself and his interlocutors, between opposing opinions, between certainty and doubt. Unlike the Platonic philosopher who leaves the everyday world in search of absolute truth, Arendt saw in Socrates a deeply political thinker, someone who accepts the messy real world and believes that thinking is born in encounter with others. His method, meutics, asking questions to help others give birth to ideas, was, for Arendt, an example of non-violent democratic political action. It treats the other not as an enemy or a follower, but as a partner in conversation. Socrates today, why does he still matter? Arendt believed that in times of crisis we need more than ever people who think, people who don't accept easy answers, who resist propaganda, who question absolute ideologies, and who have the courage to say no when necessary. Socrates, for her, is still the model of that stance, not as a distant hero, but as a practical example, someone who shows, with his own life, what it means to live responsibly, think independently, and act with courage. In a world where critical thinking is often attacked, where political polarization kills dialogue, and where many prefer slogans over arguments, the Socratic lesson is urgent. The danger is not thinking too much, but thinking too little. Socrates teaches us to keep judgment alive, even when everything pushes against it. Arendt. In the end, Socrates embodies Arendt's greatest hope, that human beings, despite pressure, systems, and ideologies, can still be free to think, to judge, to act, to resist, free to live with themselves and with others in a plural world. The freedom Socrates lived, and that Arendt so deeply valued, is not the freedom to do whatever we want, but the freedom to act according to conscience, even when it costs us. That is the freedom Arendt tried to defend in her work, not as an abstract ideal, but as a daily practice of responsibility and thought. Socrates, with his inner dialogue and refusal to betray his soul, remains a guide for anyone who refuses to live in the silence of conformity. Because, as Arendt reminds us, thinking is dangerous, but not thinking is worse. Imagine standing between two worlds. Behind you, the past is collapsing. Ahead of you, the future is a vague, shapeless horizon. You have no map, no compass, but you still carry the responsibility of choosing a direction. It's exactly in this empty space, between what once was and what doesn't yet exist, that Hannah Arendt decides to think. In 1961, she published one of her boldest works, Between Past and Future. More than just a collection of essays, the book is like a map of the modern soul, fragmented, orphaned of certainties, but in some ways freer than ever. For Arendt, the modern world went through a break without precedent. The pillars that once helped us make sense of reality, tradition, authority, religion, shared common sense, have been shattered. What remains is not pure nothingness, but a kind of historical silence. The past no longer guides us, and the future has not yet spoken. Tradition has lost its power as the chain linking past and present. It has broken, and now it is up to us to decide what is worth remembering. This isn't just a philosophical statement. It's a call to responsibility. For centuries, the West leaned on the belief that the past contained stable truths. The Greeks gave us virtue, the Romans respect for authority, the Judeo-Christian tradition, ideas like faith, sin, redemption. But in the 20th century, after 2 world wars, genocide, and totalitarian regimes, these references no longer seemed to hold. Arendt watched in disbelief. The world that promised progress had built concentration camps. Reason, celebrated since the Enlightenment, had been used to design industrial mass murder. The result was brutal. We no longer knew what to trust. Tradition was in ruins. But for Arendt, this collapse wasn't only a loss, it was a condition of modern freedom. When old authorities no longer force us down a fixed path, we are the ones who have to think, to judge, to choose. The modern human being, in her view, lives between past and future, no longer standing on solid inherited ground, but also unable to rest on vague promises of what's to come. We live in a time of discontinuity. The stories we inherited no longer fully convince us, and we haven't built new ones strong enough to replace them. The past doesn't dictate the rules anymore, and the future often brings not hope, but anxiety about ecological collapse, technology, political breakdown. Modernity is not the rational paradise the 19th century imagined. It's open, fragile, unstable, but full of possibility. So Arendt asks, what can we do when our shared world no longer offers clear direction? How do we act politically when our reference points are gone? Her answer is clear and uncomfortable. We have to learn to think and judge for ourselves. What is most striking in Arendt is that she does not see the collapse of tradition as pure disaster. She sees an opportunity, because it is in this gap between past and future that the space of freedom opens up. Freedom is not guaranteed by anything. It exists only in practice, when we decide to act, to speak, to begin something new. For Arendt, freedom is not just inner feeling or private choice. Freedom is political action, stepping into the public world with others and doing something that wasn't there before. But we can only act freely if we have the courage to think without crutches, without copy-pasting old formulas, without hiding behind yesterday's authorities. This in-between space becomes a place of birth. Arendt connects it to natality, a central idea for her. Every human being, simply by being born, brings the capacity to start something new. If the past can no longer just be repeated, then the only tradition that matters is the one we choose to carry forward, not as dead weight, but as living inheritance, critically received. In Between Past and Future, Arendt also takes on the crisis of authority. When tradition falls, institutions lose their grounding. Schools no longer educate as before. Parents lose unquestioned standing. Political leaders lose credibility. She draws a line between true authority and authoritarian domination. Real authority doesn't rely on force. It is recognized because it is rooted in a meaningful past, something shared, remembered, respected. When the past stops being a common reference, authority collapses. What's left tends to be either brutal authoritarianism or total fragmentation of the public world. Both are dangerous. That's why she argues we must recover some sense of tradition, not to restore it blindly, but to consciously choose what deserves to be preserved and what must be left behind. In one of the book's most powerful essays, Arendt writes about education. To educate, she says, is to introduce the new into an old world, and at the same time to preserve the world for those who are coming. Here, her view is almost poetic. Adults are mediators between past and future. We are not owners of the world, we are temporary guardians. Education is a political act. It is a gesture of trust in the future. But it is also an act of judgment. We must decide what is worth passing on. And that decision demands reflection, courage, and a sense of responsibility. One of Arendt's great strengths is that she refuses two easy paths: nostalgic reaction, let's go back to how things were, and modern nihilism, nothing from the past matters. She takes a harder route. She wants us to think with the past, to understand it, judge it, learn from it, without becoming its prisoners. The past belongs to us, only if we are able to choose it. Between past and future doesn't give ready-made answers. It gives us questions and places the weight and the freedom back on us. To build a world from broken pieces, to create meaning where there once were unquestioned dogmas, to make politics where there once was mere routine, to act where there once was only obedience. The real lesson of this book is not in any single conclusion, but in the posture Arendt invites us to take, to stand in the empty space with dignity, in the gap between what was and what will be, in the uncomfortable space of freedom. She doesn't comfort us with promises. She doesn't sell easy solutions. But she shows that even when the world seems without direction, our ability to think, judge, and act is still alive. Tradition has crumbled, but thought can build something new, and each of us, through our words, our choices, our actions, and our refusals, takes part in that beginning. When no one is listening anymore, who can still teach? Picture a child standing in front of a dying fire. She's holding a small stick, waiting for someone to help her bring the flame back. But the adults around her are distracted, staring at screens, talking about numbers, obsessed with efficiency. No one believes in the fire anymore. And that child quietly learns that the world can be dark, and that maybe no one will teach her how to light anything at all. For Hannah Arendt, this is the image of the crisis of education. And more than that, it's a crisis of civilization. By the mid-20th century, after 2 world wars, Arendt saw a silent collapse taking place. Adults had lost faith in authority, not just as power, but as responsibility. Parents no longer educated with clarity, teachers no longer taught with conviction, and politicians no longer led with legitimacy. What was left? A generation adrift, and a world without a bridge between past and future. For Arendt, real authority is rare. It doesn't shout, bully, or manipulate. It holds things up. A true teacher, a true leader, a true parent doesn't impose the truth. They present the world, like someone carefully holding out something precious and saying, "Here is what was built before you arrived. Take care of it." Educational authority, then, is not about taming the child. It's about introducing them to the world. It's not about obedience. It's about entry. To educate is to say, this is the world we live in. You're going to inherit it, and you need to be ready to live in it with freedom and responsibility. But what happens when adults themselves no longer believe in this world? When they've lost faith in culture, in politics, in history itself? Arendt is blunt. The problem with modern education is that adults gave up on being adults. In the name of children's freedom, many stopped taking responsibility. In the name of modernity, they abandoned tradition. In the name of neutrality, they refused to judge. But for her, a society that is afraid of seeming authoritarian in front of its children makes a fatal mistake. Because authority is not the same as authoritarianism. The kind of authority she defends is intergenerational responsibility, not controlling the future, but maintaining what makes freedom possible. We are responsible for a world we did not create, but that we entrust to the young. With the loss of authority, school turns into something else, a skills factory, a place where you learn just to pass tests, get a job, hit targets. Education policy starts to follow the logic of productivity, metrics, spreadsheets, assessments, as if education were an assembly line. But Arendt asks the uncomfortable question: what exactly are we teaching? If what we teach doesn't connect young people to the real world, to culture, to responsibility, it becomes empty training. We teach math without justice, writing without thinking, technology without limits. When the teacher is no longer a living authority, when they're there only to push content or enforce rules, the link between generations breaks. Arendt saw this crisis of authority as a direct threat to cultural continuity. Culture only survives when it is inherited with meaning, and that demands an adult who says, "This is worth preserving." An adult who judges, who chooses what to teach, who passes on not just information, but a way of being in the world. Without that, culture is replaced by trends. Noise replaces content. Speed replaces memory. The child grows up, but without solid ground. For Arendt, the crisis of education is directly tied to the crisis of politics. Where there is no legitimate authority in public life, education weakens. And the opposite is also true. A poorly educated generation tears at the fabric of democracy. Because someone who never learned to listen to legitimate authority also never learns to listen to others. Someone who was never introduced to the world of culture never learns to care for it. And someone who's never seen an adult act with courage will probably not take on responsibility later. Freedom does not come from the absence of authority, but from the ability to act in a world that has continuity. Arendt says the educator stands in a difficult but vital place, between the old world and the new one. They cannot ignore what has been built, and they cannot block what is coming. They are the bridge. This takes humility, but also firmness. The educator is not there to be just a buddy, and not there to be a tyrant. They are there to be the one who presents the world, the one who, even with shaking hands, still holds what is left of the flame, and offers it so others can carry it on. If Arendt leaves one message on this topic, it's this: the freedom of future generations depends on the responsibility of adults now. To educate is an act of courage. It is facing the world on behalf of those who don't yet know how to live in it. It is saying yes to the task of preserving, judging, passing things on, not as guardians of a dead past, but as people who understand that freedom only grows where there are roots. The crisis of authority in education is not a crisis of rules. It's a crisis of meaning. When adults run from responsibility, they leave the world in the hands of chance. And the cost is not just bad schools. It is the loss of culture, the breakdown of politics, and in the end, the erosion of freedom. That's why Arendt calls us: educate, judge, preserve. Say, this matters. Because when a child finds an adult who truly believes in something, that child also finds a path, and with it, a chance not to walk in the dark. When a human being is born, the chance for a new world is born too. In Hannah Arendt's thought, there is a quiet word running through everything she wrote, like a line of hope in the middle of chaos: natality. It's not a common term, and it's barely developed in most of Western philosophy. But for her, it's maybe the most political idea of all, because it represents what totalitarianism tried to erase, and what, even among ruins, still survives: the human capacity to begin again. For Arendt, natality is not just biological birth. It's more than coming into the world. It's the ability to start something that has never existed before, to bring in the unexpected, to make possible what seemed impossible. In other words, it's the ground of real political freedom. We usually think of birth as a physical or chronological beginning. Arendt takes this further. For her, every new person who comes into the world is a unique, unpredictable event, and because of that, carries revolutionary potential. Every person who is born carries the possibility of interrupting the flow of history, changing its direction, resisting repetition. A new human being is not just one more. They are singular, unprecedented. And that's why Arendt links natality to freedom. Only free beings can truly start something new. Natality, and not mortality, may be the central category of political thought. The human condition. This line flips a long tradition on its head. Arendt is saying, politics should not be built mainly around the fear of death, as many thinkers after Hobbes imagined, but around the reality of birth. Politics does not come only from self-preservation. It comes from the desire to create, renew, and begin. And who does that? Human beings, because we are capable of action. Arendt had seen the horrors of the 20th century firsthand: persecution, exile, censorship, concentration camps, the banality of evil. Beyond the violence, she saw something even more disturbing: an attempt to wipe out the new. Totalitarianism, for her, is the denial of natality. It tries to turn people into replaceable parts, destroy spontaneity, erase individuality. Totalitarian regimes fear the new because the new can't be fully controlled. It doesn't fit into plans or statistics. A new person can think, dream, rebel, can break patterns, can say no, can act where only obedience was expected. So natality is living resistance. It's the reminder that even after the worst disasters, humanity can start over. In The Human Condition, Arendt talks about three basic human activities: labor, work, and action. Labor is the biological cycle of life: eating, sleeping, producing to survive. Work is the creation of lasting things: tools, buildings, objects, the human-made world. Action is what makes us fully human, the unpredictable gesture of stepping into the world with others, with freedom and plurality. Natality is directly tied to action. Being born physically is not enough. The new beginning becomes real when someone steps out into the public world, acts, speaks, and appears before others. So natality is the starting point. Action is how that beginning takes shape in the world. One of Arendt's most beautiful and demanding ideas is that the new is always possible, but never automatic. Time passing doesn't guarantee change. Systems falling don't guarantee renewal. For something truly new to appear, someone has to act. She knew history repeats itself. The same authoritarian impulses return with new faces. The same fear, the same indifference, the same violence. But she also knew that even in dark times, one act, a word, a refusal, a decision, a stand, can break the pattern. That's why natality is not just a poetic concept. It's a direct reminder. You can be the beginning of something new, but only if you act. If every person carries this power to begin, there has to be a place where beginnings can show up. For Arendt, that place is the public space. Action becomes political when it is visible, when it's shared, when it echoes among different people. Natality as a political force depends on a common world. Without that, the new gets swallowed by indifference. Natality also requires plurality. There is no new without others who can see it, respond to it, argue with it, carry it forward. Every beginning is, in some sense, an invitation to live together differently. Arendt didn't keep this idea in the realm of theory. She saw natality in real life, in small and big gestures that interrupt the flow of conformity. When someone says, "This is wrong," in the face of injustice, they're exercising natality. When a teacher sparks a student's independent thinking, something new begins. When an ordinary person speaks up to defend human dignity, even alone, that is natality at work. You won't see these acts in charts or official reports. But for Arendt, they're what keeps the human world alive. She doesn't romanticize the new. She knows that beginning again is fragile, risky, uncertain. What is new can be crushed. The world can reject it. But even so, it's worth it, because every new human being is living proof that the world is still being given another chance. And that fact by itself is political. It is quietly revolutionary. Each new birth is a yes to the world. Hannah Arendt. In a century that tried in so many ways to erase humanity, through extermination, through mass manipulation, through numbing conformity, Arendt chose not nihilism, but natality. She knew the weight of the past. She knew the pull of resignation. But she also knew this: as long as there is someone willing to act, to say no, to think differently, the story is not closed. Birth, in her thought, is not a cliché of optimism. It is concrete possibility. If you're hearing this, reading this, living in this moment, you carry natality with you, not just because you were once born, but because you can still begin something honest, something brave, something that breaks with what shouldn't continue. Maybe no one will notice. Maybe it will seem small, but that's how freedom survives, through real actions from ordinary people in difficult times. You can be the turning point, the break in the pattern, the beginning the world hasn't seen yet, because, as Arendt reminds us, the new is never guaranteed, but it is always possible. Freedom is not only a light inside us, it's a step into the shared world. Imagine someone alone in a quiet room, eyes closed, meditating, feeling at peace and free. That has its place. But for Hannah Arendt, it's not enough. Real freedom shows up when we open our eyes, leave the room, step into the world, and speak with others. For her, freedom is political action, not just inner experience. In The Human Condition, 1958, Arendt takes aim at a long philosophical tradition that glorified contemplation, solitude, and withdrawal from the world, from Plato onward. This tradition tends to see politics as messy, impure, and inferior to some higher spiritual or intellectual life. Arendt flips this upside down. In her view, politics is exactly where human freedom is lived. Since Plato, many thinkers place the good in the inner life, found through contemplation, calm, and a kind of rise above the material world. The philosopher turns away from the city, searching for pure truth. Political action starts to look like distraction or corruption. Arendt strongly criticizes this split. For her, this way of thinking stripped politics of its true value. It ignored the kind of freedom that only appears when we step into the world with others, to speak, to begin something, to take a stand. Freedom that exists only inside my mind may be sincere, but it's incomplete. Action, a central word for Arendt, is what makes someone truly free. Action happens when we become visible to others, when we start something that wasn't already scripted. That ability to begin, to do what no one man do, no one programmed, is, for her, the real core of freedom. Freedom is not the right to choose, but the condition of acting in a shared world. Arendt distinguishes different kinds of freedom. One is negative freedom, not being locked up, not being censored, not being oppressed. That matters, of course, but she says it's not enough. There is a deeper freedom, the freedom to act, to initiate, to do things together in public. When we get involved politically, when we speak, organize, deliberate, create something with others, we move beyond just surviving or producing. We stop being limited to what she calls labor, meeting basic needs, or work, making things, and become agents, people who can change the situation. Politics, in this sense, is not just administration, management, or running the state. It is the stage where human freedom appears. If we turn politics into nothing more than technical management, we drain it of freedom. Arendt argues that a lot of modern thinking turned freedom into something purely internal, a feeling, a mindset, self-realization, spirituality, therapy. And when freedom becomes only private and invisible, cut off from others, politics fades. The public space empties out. When we retreat into ourselves, into, as long as I'm okay inside, that's what matters, we leave the shared world in the hands of whoever wants to control it. The space for action shrinks. The number of voices drops. Plurality weakens. Arendt is not against contemplation or inner life. She takes thinking, willing, and judging very seriously. But she's clear. Political freedom needs more. It needs presence, speech, initiative, exposure. Picture a society where everyone says, what really matters is my inner peace, my personal journey, and chooses not to participate in public life. Decisions will still be made. Power will still act. Injustice will still grow. Only now, without resistance. Those people may feel free inside, but in practice, they've given up their freedom where it matters politically. Now think of an ordinary person who questions an unjust rule, speaks in a community meeting, starts a petition, organizes others, or simply refuses to go along with something wrong. There is risk, doubt, fear, but they act. In that act, Arendt would say, they experience real freedom. For her, these are the key examples. To act politically is to live freely. Freedom is not guaranteed just by laws on paper, though they help. It's kept alive by people who step out, show up, and take responsibility in public. This idea connects directly to Arendt's other concepts: natality, the power to begin, and plurality, the fact that we live among different people. Every person brings the possibility of a new beginning. Action is how that beginning appears, and it only makes sense among others, with many voices and perspectives sharing the world. When freedom gets reduced to, I feel free inside, it ignores what Arendt calls the in-between, the space between people where action and speech happen. True freedom lives there, in dialogue, in disagreement, in cooperation, in exposure. Looking at the 20th century, Arendt saw how totalitarian regimes, mass societies and bureaucracies turned politics into obedience and routine. Public life became either controlled, hollow, or turned into a show. People stopped acting, they just followed. And where there is no real action, there is no real freedom. In such a world, freedom gets downgraded to lifestyle, consumption, or private mood. You feel free, but nothing changes. The space where freedom should appear, the shared world, is empty or staged. This is the danger Arendt is warning about. Politics as pure technique, public life as empty ritual, freedom as just choice without responsibility. For her, there is no freedom without action. So for a history or philosophy channel today, Arendt's lesson is sharp and timely. In a time where many think freedom is achieved by going inward, meditation, self-help, isolation, working on myself, Arendt reminds us, lived freedom is public, visible, shared, and often risky. She is basically saying, get off the couch, speak up, join, organize, show your face, take part, because if we all stay safe in our private comfort, the world moves on without us. And someone else decides what freedom will mean. For Hannah Arendt, freedom is not a cozy inner state. It is not hiding. It is not a private bubble of authenticity. Freedom is political action, visible, plural, exposed. It is stepping out among others, starting something, claiming responsibility. If you're turning this into a video, there's a powerful hook right here. If freedom is real, where does it show up? Not just in what we feel, but in what we dare to do, together. That's the force of Arendt's idea. Freedom happens in the world, between us, when we decide to act. When thinking takes its time, the work stays open. And in that openness, it invites us to think. In the last years of her life, Hannah Arendt dedicated herself to an ambitious and daring project. a work about what she called the life of the mind, vita contemplativa, in a world she had mostly analysed through action, politics, history, public life. That project became the life of the mind, where she set out to explore three main human faculties: thinking, willing, and judging. But the book is unfinished. Arendt died before completing the third part on judging, and this unfinished state, far from weakening the work, makes it even more powerful. It invites us into the break, into the gap, to reflect on what it means to think without guarantees, to will without a script, and to judge when nothing is fully settled. The Life of the Mind was designed as a three-part inquiry into the human condition: thinking, the inner dialogue, the me with myself, where meaning and conscience begin; willing, connected to action, choice, decision, the power to start something; judging, where we weigh, evaluate, and decide what is right, beautiful, or just, together in the shared world. Arendt had already explored the active life in The Human Condition, 1958, with her distinction between labour, work, and action. Now she turned inward, not to escape the world, but to understand the inner foundations that support how we appear and act in it. In that sense, The Life of the Mind is her most introspective work, yet still fully engaged with reality. In the first volume, Thinking, Arendt examines what moves us to think: wonder, doubt, this silent inner conversation. In the second, Willing, she looks at the will, our struggle with freedom, decision, and the desire to begin. The third volume, Judging, was never completed. Only the beginning exists. Each of these faculties is a key to her philosophy. Thinking connects us to our inner life, to conscience, to the responsibility of being a friend to oneself. Without thinking, we become easy prey for obedience and the banality of evil. Willing connects us to freedom, the power to begin, to choose, to break routine. Judging is the bridge between the two, where thought and will meet to decide what we should or shouldn't do with others in the shared world. This three-part structure shows how Arendt saw human freedom, not as something simple or one-dimensional, but as something that depends on the connection between these faculties. It's not enough to think if we never will. Not enough to will if we can't judge. Not enough to judge if we haven't truly thought. The Life of the Mind was published after her death in 2 volumes, Thinking and Willing. Judging remained unfinished, with only drafts and notes. Arendt's death left the last part as a work in progress. But that work in progress has a symbolic meaning. Judgment, for her, was always tied to plurality, to the world, to experience. It's not something you can close in a strict system. Maybe it stayed unfinished because judgment itself is never final. It depends on encounters with reality, with others, with history. For us, this interruption works as a warning. No human philosophy is complete. Real thinking demands openness, humility, and an acceptance of what is incomplete. Arendt lived that truth, a thinker who faced totalitarianism, exile, and rupture, and still kept thinking. That vulnerability gives her work its strength. One of the powerful things in The Life of the Mind is how it ties the inner world to the political one. Arendt never believed in a pure thinking that was detached from life. For her, thinking that never risks comfort becomes empty. Willing that never reaches for something new stays trapped in repetition. Judging that never leads to action is dead. The book completes the circle of her earlier work. If political action needs natality, plurality, and freedom, then it also needs inner foundations: thinking, willing, and judging. Without them, politics collapses into conformity, ideology, or violence, as she had already seen in totalitarian regimes. So this unfinished work is not a failure, but a testimony. It shows that human freedom is always at risk, that the mind is never done, and that the world constantly demands that we think with responsibility, will with courage, and judge with care. Today, in an age of polarization, superficial noise, and constant speed, the life of the mind feels even more necessary. Thinking, the silent conversation with myself, stands against the culture of endless distraction. Willing, the ability to begin something real, stands against paralysis, cynicism, and nothing will change. Judging, the part she never finished, stands against instant outrage, shallow takes, and mob opinion. If the work is unfinished, maybe that is the point. It leaves the task to us. Each reader, each citizen, each creator is invited to continue the reflection on judgment. What are we going to do with this world? What should we defend? Where do we draw the line? With whom do we act? If there is an image that captures the life of the mind, it's that of an unfinished journey. Arendt walks beside us, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who knows the path is uncertain and still worth taking. She shows that the human mind is always moving between thought and action, between will and judgment, between inner life and public world. And maybe that is her final lesson. Freedom is not achieved by finishing the book, but by living the process. To keep thinking, even when it's uncomfortable. To keep willing, even when it's risky. To keep judging, even when it's hard and the outcome is unclear. Because, as Arendt suggests, the world is not finished, and it needs people who think, who will, and who judge. The human mind, in that sense, is always still to come. Thinking is not an escape. It's a form of resistance. When Hannah Arendt wrote about totalitarianism, she was not just describing the past. She was opening a dangerous window into the future. And now, in the 21st century, that window is wide open. Her work is no longer just a distant warning. It's a mirror. We live in fast, fragmented, hyper-technological times. Language has lost depth, political speech has lost shame, and ordinary people have lost their points of reference. The question is inevitable. What does Arendt still have to say to us? The answer is more unsettling than comforting. Arendt was not progressive, liberal, or conservative. She rejected labels and paid the price for it. She criticized Zionism and was called a traitor by many Jews. She exposed Eichmann without turning him into a monster and was hated for humanizing him. She rejected both the naivety of parts of the left and the cynicism of parts of the right. That's the first essential part of her legacy today. Thinking takes courage because real thinking bothers people. In a time when everyone feels pressured to pick a side, when loyalty to a camp is treated as a moral virtue, Arendt reminds us, to think is to move between sides, without selling yourself to any of them. If today's politics feels like a predictable theatre, it's partly because we lack people like her, willing to think against the grain, even at the cost of isolation. Today, words like freedom, justice, the people, and even truth have been worn down into slogans. Politicians repeat them like empty mantras. Arendt warned us, when political language loses substance, collective thinking gets sick. She said systematic lying was one of the strongest tools of totalitarianism. But our current danger goes even further. It's the collapse of the line between true and false. The problem isn't just that people believe fake news. It's that many no longer care whether something is fake or not. That's worse than ignorance. It's the abandonment of judgment. And for Arendt, that's the end of the political world, because politics only exists among people who can still tell the difference. When that dies, mass manipulation walks in, dressed up as opinion. Arendt never saw social media, algorithms, or deepfakes, but she would clearly understand their effect. A world where thinking seems optional. We scroll at high speed. We comment before we read. We react before we understand. Anxiety trains us to think less, and the system rewards quick reactions. Arendt would call this the trivialization of judgment, and she knew exactly where that kind of habit leads. When people stop thinking, evil doesn't always arrive with shouting. It arrives quietly, through omission, through the inability to tell what is right from what is just convenient. Eichmann, for Arendt, was not a monster. He was an obedient bureaucrat, a man unable, or unwilling, to think about what he was doing. In the 21st century, this figure has returned, now in a suit, online, speaking in the name of efficiency. 21st century populism is digital, emotional, fast. Arendt helps us understand it without clichés. Modern populists don't win through argument, they win through performance. They turn politics into a show and citizens into a cheering crowd. Populism works because it offers belonging without responsibility. Arendt would see there the mark of the mass man, someone who feels lost and embraces any leader who says, "I'll think for you." A leader who basically says, "You don't need to judge, just follow me." She would say, populism grows where real politics disappears. When the public space becomes a battlefield of fan clubs, plurality dies. And when plurality dies, freedom dies with it. One of today's big mistakes is thinking freedom means doing whatever I want. Arendt would roll her eyes at that. For her, freedom only truly exists when we live it with others, in public, taking responsibility for the consequences. What we often have today is consumption dressed up as freedom. Choosing between 1,000 products is not freedom. Cancelling someone because you disagree is not freedom. Saying whatever you want without caring about its impact is not freedom. It's emptiness. Arendt teaches that real freedom is acting consciously in the shared world, and that's hard work. It means thinking before speaking, judging before acting, owning what we do. The 21st century suffers from an ethical illness, comfortable neutrality. People say, "I don't have an opinion," or "I stay out of politics," as if that were a virtue. For Arendt, that is a mission, and a mission is a form of complicity. For her, judging was not about having ready-made answers. It was about the effort to understand, and still take a stand, even without absolute certainty. She reworks Kant's idea of enlarged mentality, putting yourself in someone else's place before you act. The world today pushes us toward instant judgments. Arendt suggests the opposite. Judge with time, with listening, with the courage to be wrong, and correct yourself. Moral judgment is not a reflex. It is a practice. Arendt's final message is both harsh and hopeful. Either we think, or we repeat evil. Thinking is not mere abstraction. It is action. Thinking is resisting the machine of repetition. It is saying no to indifference. It is acting, even when nobody's watching. And that is probably her most important legacy for our time. The stubborn insistence on thinking, especially when everything around us tries to make us stop. She didn't leave us a formula. She left us an attitude. Think, will, judge, act, that is still in our hands. If you made it this far, thank you. Diving into Hannah Arendt's thought is not easy. It's deep, uncomfortable, and necessary. But if you stayed until the end, it's because you also feel, like she did, that thinking is more urgent today than ever. Now, if this video made sense to you, sparked any ideas, questions, or even disagreement, drop a comment down below. Let's keep this conversation going, because real politics happens in dialogue. And of course, if you like this content, hit the like button to help the channel. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There's a lot more coming. Share this with someone who needs to hear about Arendt, or who's trying to make sense of this chaotic world we're living in. And don't leave just yet. There are other videos on the channel about major thinkers, ethical dilemmas, and philosophical questions to help you think more clearly and act more consciously. Stay with us, think with us, and, as Arendt would say, never stop thinking. See you in the next video.